Enjoy this Aztlander presentation. Reflective transformation imaging reveals the hidden past at Izapa with Dr. Jason Jones and Dennis Lisonbee. We now join Dennis Lisonbee's introduction, where he discusses the important contributions and research made by Garth Norman that resulted in many important books on Izapan sculpture.
In fact, I think without those two publications, we could make a claim that perhaps Izapa may have only become a footnote in history, while other archaeologists, Garth's peers, left Izapa. Garth stuck with it for his whole lifetime. I've been to Izapa with him. I've also been to a sacred Native American site called Parowan Gap, Utah, which is a Native American temple site not far from where we live here in Utah. I went there and I was amazed at how Garth pointed out how this temple in Utah that dates to 700 AD parallels with what we saw established in Izapa, pre-classic Maya. It's amazing that Izapa has influenced the Mayan culture and other cultures. There had to have been migrations from Izapa that went through North America. I know they went down to Peru. We can find sites in Peru that's also set up exactly like Izapa. Today, we're here with Jason Jones, and I've been very excited to be able to work with Garth and Jason doing some video production on the technology that Jason introduced into Izapa, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Dr. Jones will be talking about that. That's allowed us to restore what's on Izapa Stela 5. I showed that restored version to a friend of mine who's a Lakota Native American. He started looking at this rendition and told me that this relates to our Sundance, and started explaining to me how Stela 5 relates to the Sundance. So there's some amazing connections that are going to give a new generation of scholars an opportunity to look at some relationships between Izapa and other cultures through North and South America. I think that's about all I have to say. I'd like to turn the time back to you, Jim, and look forward to what Dr. Jones has to say.
All righty, take it over, Jason.
Perfect. Great to be with you all this evening, and thanks so much to Dennis. You will see much of Dennis's input on some of the visuals that I will use, the tools that I've been fortunate to help Garth and Dennis and everybody use at Izapa. To our knowledge, this was the first introduction of these tools down, certainly at Izapa, and perhaps in Mesoamerica, it's among the first, if not the first. And we're really going to look at some details to try and address weathering. Now, this is kind of a universal problem. I lived in Mexico for multiple years. I really enjoy it down there. Mexico, as with all nations that have a lot of archaeological sites, have a challenge of how to distribute the funds that are available to maintain and improve and continue to excavate and learn. For those of you who haven't been to Izapa, when you walk around Izapa, it is not visually as impressive as many of the sites, even in the area, but throughout Mesoamerica. It's relatively humble in terms of the state in which it has been preserved. And what is so interesting about Izapa is actually what's been recorded there. And so we hope by virtue of these tools that have captured things digitally, it'll actually provide you a very rich experience without needing to actually visit Izapa. So without further ado, let me add some visuals to this. And I failed to mention bienvenidos. If there's anybody who are Spanish speakers here, happy to have you as well. So on screen, what you're looking at is an image of one of the most complicated stela that is at Izapa, which is just on the border between Mexico and Guatemala. It's on the Mexican side and in the shadow of the tallest volcanic peak there in Central America. With all things that are rich in history, I hope we all share this love of things that have the potential to still teach us something. Virginia Smith noted that this depiction on Stela 5 is the most detailed, important tree of life rendering in the ancient world. She also then adds in in the same article, that unfortunately, it's difficult to interpret what's on there, partly because it has weathered so much. And so growing up with my last name is Jones, I thought for sure that I must be related somewhere to Indiana. And I can't help but quote him tonight, which is, "It belongs in a museum." This is a refrain spoken by many. And as I traveled throughout Mexico, specifically at Izapa and surrounding areas with Garth Norman, multiple times he referenced more than one stela that belong in a museum. And in particular, Stela 5, I believe, fits that bill very well. And so if we were to say, okay, what's so unique about it? We have a little video to introduce you to it.
We're not hearing.
Eroded, buried,
Are you hearing any audio?
Yes.
Good, thanks.
decomposed, uncovered, weathered, vandalized, stolen, and recovered. It is a miracle that any of the low relief carvings on this volcanic stone, known as Izapa Stela 5, are still visible at all. In addition to the physical deterioration, the healthy academic debate about its meaning has been largely silenced. Over 2,000 years since its creation, Izapa Stela 5 now stands again in its original location, along with over 100 other stone monuments at Izapa, Mexico. They stand as a reminder of a once flourishing Mayan civilization and should be a central topic for connecting Mesoamerican cultural identity to its origins.
Izapa is unique because it's never been built over. And so there's 140 plus monuments that are all in their original locations. And so we get to go all the way back to the origins of why are these stones laid out the way they are? What does the carving on those stones mean and how do they interact?
The varied interpretations of what is carved stems from the difficulty of discerning what was originally there. In 1938, educator Carlos Calabro found Stela 5 on its back in the jungle and did the first drawing. He interpreted what was on the stone as a market scene. In 1941, on a National Geographic and Smithsonian Institution expedition, archaeologist Matthew Sterling said of Stela 5, "This curious stela is the largest and most ambitious in composition of any at Izapa."
So I'd just like to pause for a minute. As you saw in the video, there are many stela there. Each one of them is interesting and beautiful in its own way. Some have been weathered to where the face is just illegible. There's nothing remaining. Many are still preserved. A lot of these stelae are in an andesite stone, which is fairly hard. And despite weathering, we can still make out significant relief. We did work on all of the stelae that had major narrative stories attached to them. We highlight in tonight's example Stela 5 because it's the most detailed of the stelae that are there. And so if I just continue a little bit longer, if we follow along on this, it belongs in a museum idea, the question then says, well, but what if that fails? Then what do you do? And I realize this is not a problem unique to Izapa. This is a problem that everyone who loves Mayan culture and all ancient cultures for that matter often can struggle with. Hopefully tonight is not just a pattern for Izapa, but also helps to become a pattern that will spread, is already spreading, but will be a pattern that will spread more widely. So looking at these two side by side, right? On the left, we have primary documentation, which is a photograph. On the right, we have a 2D line drawing. When you go from three-dimensional surface to 2D line drawings, you have to use some judgment and skill. You are making an interpretation. And I hope that transition is clear to all the listeners, but I wanted to just highlight it. As we go through, the first ideal is we want to preserve everything that's there. If we can preserve it physically, that's the highest priority. If there are some compromises there due to budget limitations and just the nature of choices that I don't have direct influence over, then we certainly would like to say there's got to be a backstop if physical deterioration is still occurring. And so if that subsequent severe weathering then lends to misinterpretation, specifically in redrawings of what's there, then we have embodied in Stela 5 a good example of this dilemma. I have on screen the major drawings of Stela 5. They date all the way back to 1938, where, as you heard in the video, Culebro, who was a local educator, was able to find this and illustrate it first. I think it's very fitting that those living nearby were able to find it and document it first. This documentation seems to have attracted the Matthew Stirling National Geographic exhibition. And as they arrived, they documented it with photos. I don't have any line drawings from their time there. However, I do want to point out something interesting. Dennis has helped find the archival video that you saw of their actual expedition. And what was very interesting to us is to see them pour water down the face of these stelas so that they could try to interpret what was there. And that struggle for interpretation, or struggle first to decipher what's there as primary evidence and then to interpret it correctly, continues to this day. And I'll tell you a little bit more
in 1958, Brigham Young University Archaeology Department Chair Dr. M. Wells Jakeman published a paper on similarities of the carving to ancient Near Eastern representations of the Tree of Life. Jakeman's work included a detailed drawing and interpretations of many of the hieroglyphs on Stela 5. From 1963 to 1973, archaeologist B.
I'm just pausing for a second. Jim, could you spotlight my video? There's a couple messages coming through saying they don't see full screen. I'll let you try and spotlight. There we go. That's better. Hopefully, thanks for the messages. Hopefully you can see better now.
Norman, under the auspices of the New World Archaeology Foundation, photographed the major Izapa sculptures, created line drawings, and published peer-reviewed albums of the reproductions and extensive analysis of what they depict. His discoveries include key astronomical alignments with the Izapa mounds and stela, the discovery of the Babylonian and Egyptian cubits as a standard of measure at Izapa, and the Maya world calendar system on Stela 5. But in 1999, in an effort to redirect discussions on Izapa interpretation, anthropologist John E. Clark of Brigham Young University and artist Ix Marino redrew Norman's NWAF sculpture drawings. In a non-peer-reviewed publication of the new drawings, Dr. Clark boldly proclaimed, "We firmly believe that further examination of the Izapa sculptures will likely reveal no significant data beyond what our drawings now show." Does this new rendering of Stela 5 truthfully take us back in time, where we can discover for ourselves what the creators of Izapa wanted to teach us? Or are we being misled? Let's investigate.
So with that as a backdrop, it's probably worth highlighting a little bit more about Izapa and how I got involved. So Izapa is located, as I mentioned earlier, So just for reference, I'm greeting you from Dallas, Texas. Hello from Texas. Relative to Texas, Izapa's way down there, down south in the Soconusco area. And it is a beautiful place to visit if you have the opportunity. It was quite a substantial, system of plazas in its day. A few of those are still being preserved or semi-preserved. This is an overlay of the existing, what was the survey of Izapa a while ago on top of Google Earth. It's about 1.5 miles long, roughly, that rectangle. So there's quite a lot of area to cover. As you walk around on the ground, this is what most of it looks like. It's been covered over by jungle, and there are some people there that are living. Some are doing some farming in other over areas that historically were sort of settled, if you will. Here is one of the plazas that is maintained. We're grateful for the roofs that are over top of the individual stones themselves. And here is an early image. You'll notice the grass roof there. This is an early image taken in the 60s or 70s of Stela 5. These are images that I took. So we had the blessing of Ina and a permit to be able to go down and get very close and intimate with these monuments. Even in pretty good daylight, it can be difficult to see what is on these stones. In normal ambient lighting, if you look carefully there, we're trying to measure a feature on the stone. And it's not very easy to see the features because of weathering. Because of the difficulty in seeing these features, we have seen in the literature over time a migration from a drawing that looks like this, which was established in 1973 specifically, but kind of since 65, a drawing like this with a few minor changes, here republished in 2012, to a redrawing that happened in the 90s and maybe into the early 2000s. And comparing between what is on this stone, they're on the same stone, but comparing the drawings of what is depicted on this top versus the bottom, there are substantial differences. And that has led to very different interpretations of what is trying to be taught and recorded as Stela 5. All of this led to a culminating moment when I was doing some field studies in the Middle East with archaeologist V. Garth Norman. We happened to be in Jerusalem, just outside the Old City. We were doing some archaeology there on the Mount of Olives, and we'd stopped to take a quick break. And I had heard that he had done quite a lot of work in Mesoamerica. And at that time, my focus was the Middle East. And he turned and said to me, Jason, I understand that you do 3D printing and 3D imaging, which is what my specialty really is. And he said, from a 3D imaging perspective, could you laser scan weathered monuments and bring out hidden detail? And I said, Garth, it depends on what's still there. All laser scanning can do is see what is actually there. I can't, go backwards in time. But if it's just become faded and it's a little bit hard to see, we can certainly look at some imaging methods to try and improve that. So we started this dialogue in the mid-2000s. And at the time, doing field studies with laser scanning was possible, but it was not super easy. And access to laser scanning equipment was limited. And so we continued along, and about 5 years later, I had the opportunity to get a hold of some equipment that could actually be used in the field. And now we're 15 years on and able now to show the results of some of what that collaboration has led to. And really what we decided was to map the surface texture of these stelae. And the specific technique that we used is called reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI. You will hear it referred to. And it helps to reveal what the hidden past is at Izapa in terms of what's carved and what's not carved on these shallow bas-reliefs. So, as mentioned earlier, 3D scanning is tremendously powerful. It's matured a lot over the last couple of decades. I hope for those of you who are active in the field, you have access and the opportunity to use this type of scanning. You see here on screen, this scanner on the left is a structured light scanner. It's capable of capturing things that are very high resolution. Literally, we're getting down to almost splitting hairs in terms of the scale of features that are possible. And you can also do it at large scale. And so here you see Mount Rushmore, and this is a kind of a blended image showing the actual monument mixed with the laser scanned version that's been captured. And here's a close-up image of the actual capturing of that surface. Particularly for Mount Rushmore, you can see working at height, it was not a simple endeavor. And for me, this is the sort of level of documentation that I was envisaging at Izapa. There's only one problem. To my knowledge, laser scanning has never been allowed at Izapa. I hope that's changed in the last couple of years, but certainly as we interacted with the local authorities, there was no inclination to encourage or allow laser scanning. And so we said, well, perhaps there's an alternative. For those of you who know photogrammetry, we did do some trials with photogrammetry. Our experience is that's useful to capture overall, but it wasn't accurate enough to really help interrogate the very fine features that are on these stelae. So we then transferred our efforts to a technique called reflectance transformation imaging. If you're familiar with photogrammetry, where your subject remains still and your lighting is constant, or ideally should be constant, and you move your camera around, reflectance transformation imaging is almost the inverse. You leave your camera stationary and your subject, and you change the lighting. And what you're doing is you're essentially trying to get raking shadows to go across this monument in different directions. And then mathematically, you take a collection of images and you calculate backwards to actually see what the surface texture is. And we calculate something called, so first of all, on a pixel by pixel basis, we're calculating the angle at which light is being reflected off of it. That's called a surface normal. And that allows us then to look at this texture in a whole new way. And I'll give you some examples of that. So here's an example of a single image capture done on a large scale. I believe this is a petroglyph, actually, that's the example was taken from. At Izapa, there are many monuments. This is just one representation of some of the monuments around one of the plazas. And of course, when you're there in person, you get a mixture of modern life with ancient, so under this green roof right here on the right is where Stela 5 lives. There, as you can see, there's a tree and other things that are very close. And so the first task at hand was to clean off any residuals from the most local inhabitants, namely birds. There were quite a few chickens that seemed to be roosting in that area. And so that was the first order of business. And then once we had a clean setup, what you're looking at here, if you look at the very top of this image, you see a little bit of gray at witness. That's actually an umbrella. Of course, we tried this in the afternoon. We got a very heavy rainstorm coming through. And if you notice, the ground is shiny there. It was very wet. And this was our initial setup to perform reflectance transformation imaging, again, just to capture that surface. And here's an example of Garth. What he is holding is illumination, and the camera, again, stays fixed. We illuminate it from multiple angles. In this case, the storm that came through was actually helpful to us because it dimmed the lighting. So it gave us a little better contrast on the images. Later, we actually learned to drape the enclosures to be able to block out some of the ambient lighting. But this initial round was really helpful to have that sort of darkened skies. Here you see an image again. This is archaeologist Garth Norman standing behind Stela 5, holding a light over top of it. And you can see from that raking light, you get pretty good level of detail, especially at the upper portion of that stone. And you can see really clearly here that the trunk of the tree and the individual branches and even some of the leaves and some of the fruit becomes quite visible. So this type of image is exactly what we want to capture. The nature of these stones is somewhat dish-shaped. So they've obviously been carved to be somewhat flat, but they tend to be thickest in the center and sort of rounded a little bit to where at the edges it's a little bit thinner. And as a result, there is no single one lighting orientation where you can capture all of the detail that you want. You notice that down here in the lower left, you got so much that's in complete shadow, it's difficult to know what's there. And so having a large number of photos shot at different angles is really key. This process took, you can do it in about an hour if you're practiced and you get there and you set up well for a single stela. And this was the series of images that resulted from the photo shoot. So you can see there are a bunch of images. You see that the lighting is taken from all different angles. And we then take all those images and we composite them together. And we're able to look at the angle of the light reflection. And that allows us to mathematically calculate what that surface really looks like. Then the image you're looking at on screen is not actually a photo, it's re-illumination of a texture map. And if we look carefully, you can actually see the left side we've stripped the color out of it because now it's a mathematical model. So you can do what you want with it, in terms of image transformation. So on the left, we've stripped the color out of it and we've said, treat this surface as if it's shiny, as if it's wet. Now, we had heard discussions that the early archaeology efforts had used water to wet the surface as uniformly as they could in order to get more light reflected off of the surface. And so this is a mathematical way of achieving something similar. And it was only recently that Dennis Lisonbee was able to find that footage of the actual wetting of the stone by the National Geographic expedition, which was just tickled us pink. We were thrilled because we had heard rumors of it and seen a little bit of evidence, but to capture it on video from the early 1940s was really exciting. So we're essentially mimicking to some degree those techniques that were done when the stone was in its less weathered condition. And if you notice here on the right, we've maintained the color, but this is still a mathematical model and allows us to illuminate from different angles. I'd like to show you a video that gives the technique a little bit more context, because when we use this mathematically generated image, we dynamically interact with it. It's as if you have all of those 50 images composited together, and we can change the angle as we're looking at it. And so this video, again, thanks to Dennis, helps to show why this technique is powerful.
Dr. Jason Jones, with a grant from England's prestigious University of Warwick, used emerging technology to examine the faces of the Izapa stele.
I'll just pause for 1 second. What you're seeing on screen is a dome with lots of lights. For relatively small objects, half a meter or a couple of feet across, you can build a dome where you get a flash in every position that you want it. When you get to much larger scale, right, where you can't hold your hands wide enough to go across it a couple of meters or larger, then it's usually impractical to build an entire dome. And instead, you actually end up moving the light around to all of the positions as if there were a dome there.
This surface texture mapping technique, specifically reflectance transformation imaging, which is a technique that was pioneered out of HP Labs and has been promoted heavily by cultural heritage imaging. It's now a widely accepted method for documenting very shallow relief and shallow textures. I've done it on multiple continents. We do it on paintings. We do it on archaeological carvings and other things. This is a very robust technique. This is able to go down and look at details that are on the scale of the thickness of a human hair. And so it gives us a far less subjective method of analyzing what the texture of that rock really is.
This technique uses light to map the surface of an object. It can be understood by looking at how sunlight moves across the earth. As the sun moves through the sky, moving light and changing shadows help reveal the actual shape and texture of the surface of the earth. Notice how the detail and patterns of the drifting sand becomes well illustrated as the sun moves in time. Fortunately for us, the modern RTI technique can help reveal the texture of these worn stones by tracking the movement of light and shadows in a similar way. This technique combines many photos taken from a fixed camera position with different lighting angles. The result is a map of the stela's texture and the ability to see it lit from virtually any angle. It also can display the stela as if the carved surfaces were shiny. Over the last decade, archaeologists V. Garth Norman and Dr. Jason B. Jones used this technique in cooperation with the Mexican archaeology authorities, INA, to preserve a record of the most detailed and important stelae at Izapa.
So again, special thanks to Dennis Lisonbee for putting that together. I hope the video came through clearly enough that you could see kind of the moving overlay. To go from ambient lighting, where it's difficult to see those details, and then to transition and finally be able to see them and light them from the angle that best shows what that texture is, has literally opened up whole new possibilities for us. And specifically for Garth Norman, he was in an interesting position in his career and in his life's work, which so much of it was spent at Izapa. He dearly loved Izapa. And he said, look, there's enough redrawing going on now based on weathered texture that often people that don't have access to the stones like I did 40 or 50 years ago, they're making mistakes. And yet, how do you counter that? So much of human history, really, our ability to discover is tied directly with new tools, right? As we go from microscopes to scanning electron microscopes to atomic force microscopy, the scale at which we can see continues to improve. And each new tool, right? Or if you go large scale, right? You think about the different telescopes, right? The Hubble and the James Webb and those that will come next. Each time we get a new tool, suddenly things become clear that we never had access to see in the past. And I believe that's what RTI can do for shallow relief. And so I'll show you a little bit more of what has gone on, but largely the last book that Garth published in 2015 was work he had done over decades, knew was correct, but he struggled to illustrate it because as you make additional discoveries, you may not have taken a photo of what you want to show, right, in 2010 or 2012, back in 1965 or 73 or 76 when he was really getting going. And it was very hard to illustrate. And so this has empowered him and given him the confidence to go forward and publish a lot of his findings. So some of the result of this technique has allowed him to go in and confirm a lot of what was originally drawn. You can see here, this is 1973. This is a line drawing overlaid on top of a photograph on the left. And then on the right is more of the analysis of line drawing and some of the alignments that we see to the heavens, which I love it when you've got solar and stellar and lunar alignments, and specifically when you're able to observe those. And as part of our travels, I was able to be with Garth and watch these alignments as they happened, both at night and during the sort of sunrise sunset period. We can see this is Stela 4 at Izapa. It's described as a bit of a priest king, and there are a number of motifs on there, but specifically what's interesting is these alignments. And then if you look on the right, it's laid out matching a mandala type layout, and there's standard measure on Stela 4. And this same standard measure, there seems to be a different standard measure for horizontal features compared to vertical features. But this tendency to use a mixed standard measure is carried out throughout many of the monuments at Izapa. And quite frankly, as we were doing this work, a lot of my life is about precision, right? Microns matter, especially in my engineering-oriented activities. And so I love precision. And as he would say, this has a fixed, measurement scale. I would measure it because I wanted to know. The easiest times to measure these features, especially in the more weathered areas, were at night, because we could take a flashlight and we could side light it. And we essentially got a little bit of what RTI does, right? That raking light allows you to see those features more easily. Then we could measure well. And whereas in the ambient daytime, it was a bit more of a challenge. It could still be done, but it just takes a little bit more work. And so we're really pleased to be able to provide to anybody that wants it now, this ability to interrogate and see what's there. So moving along, we see now this is Stela 5 again. In this case, this is an excerpt from Garth's last book, talking about the calendrics at Izapa. And he is showing how Stela 5 was laid out according to standard measure, and according to his analysis, actually incorporated a date chronology pattern within those carvings. And so you can go look at his book for the interpretation. That's not my area of expertise, but certainly to be able to witness what is on that stone and be able to measure it and say, hey, this is standard measure. I can see it, I can measure it. It was very, very exciting.
This data preserves a record of how much detail remains on each stela against additional weathering or damage.
3D scanning is ideal for capturing an overall form of something. It can also capture color. What is more difficult is that often you're not measuring the surface normals with the same degree of fidelity. And so where you actually want the surface texture, that's where this technique shines.
Comparison is revealing remarkable agreement between the RTI imaging and the photographs taken during the excavations of Izapa in the 1960s and 1970s by the New World Archaeology Foundation. This helps clarify many of the details carved into the stelae at Izapa.
So Clark and Moreno did work in 1999 in which they used a video camera and side lighting to zoom in and out of these stela and claimed that they had documented at a revolutionary level the detail that no one would ever be able to replicate again. My personal response to that is that they were able to identify some details that were not, up to that point, identified at Izapa. They also then illustrated many things that were subjective and are not substantiated by surface texture mapping now. So I don't believe that what they did, that they ever made their primary documentation available for interrogation. And the methodology that we have used does not sustain about 95% of the changes they have made to the original NWAF drawings and surveys. Their technique was analog. Part of my concern and my hypothesis is that their explanation of using the zoom feature let them zoom so far in, they actually lost context for everything around it. And if you get too deep in without context, it's very easy to confuse the random surface texture that's the result of weathering with carved detail. And we have documented in numerous places details that they assert are on that stone with neighboring marks of the same depth and same surface normal that they disregarded, that they cannot ignore if they're going to maintain the features that they've asserted.
Just pause for a second. What we've just shown this video of is our conclusion after nearly a decade of study. And that is that contrary to what normally happens, where a newly released drawing comes out that does have improvements, what we're finding from surface texture mapping is it actually sustains the drawings from the 70s as being more authentic representation and primary evidence there. The methodology, if we follow kind of the 1990s and 2000 drawings, they describe that they actually composited together motifs from multiple stelae in order to represent what could be there. And they've called it an artistic rendering. It certainly is that. It's artistic. I'm perfectly happy for it to be considered an artistic interpretation, but it can't also be primary documentation or the best primary documentation that there is. And so there's a bit of a paradox there. And one of the tools that we've used, what we've expanded upon to go beyond reflectance transformation imaging, is being able to represent that digitally on screen is a huge thing. But also I have here, this is a textured print. And so I hope you'll be able to see, you might be able to see thickness here. We were able to actually recreate from the RTI images, the actual texture, maybe you can hear it if I get close enough, right? Of what's on there, which now gives us the ability to look at this stone. This is about quarter scale. Okay, the full size would be a little hard to even put in an office sometimes. But this is extremely high resolution and gives us an actual texture map. So now, instead of having to be there in the field where you can't see it, we've captured the color and the relief and been able to print it into what's, essentially a high contrast and textured way of interrogating Stela 5. So this is really fun and exciting. And even for those who are smaller or children or maybe sight impaired, it's a really nice way to interact with the research. And this type of 3D printing is becoming more widespread. And I'm really grateful for lots of types of 3D printing, but this is particularly special to me. And hopefully it's the sort of thing that I hope ends up in lots of museums and lots of teaching arenas, so that everybody that A, can't travel, or B, may not have the interest or means to do it, they're able to interact in some way with it. So I'm going to resume the video for a minute. What you're going to see now is some comparisons of specific features that show where RTI has really highlighted what is actually carved on those stones versus what is artistic in the most recent set of drawings. And I advocate, based on the results of this technique, that we should, as an academic community, go back to the 70s drawings or sort of have a retouched version from the 70s that says this is the best primary evidence, primary documentation of what's on that stela. And then we can go on from interpretations from there. So resuming now with National Geographic.
In 41, Matthew Sterling's Smithsonian Institute photo, when compared with the texture map, supports the accuracy of both the 2017 texture map and the Norman drawing. Look.
I'm just going to pause for 1 second. What you saw was a slow fade from the photograph from 1941. I don't know of any line drawings from the National Geographic Expedition, but that slow fade from that photo to RTI is really intended to show there's a little bit of perspective, camera perspective difference, which is a global issue, right? But I'm not subjectively picking and choosing like you have to do when you do line art. This is globally applied across the entire image. We love this. We do not want to throw away old data, right? This is a new technique. It should be used in concert with all of the tools and all of the data available, including the most recent drawings, but especially the earliest photos and drawings when you were in when the stelae were in their least weathered situation.
At the texture mapping, we can see some additional detail on the faces and in the god masks compared to what was documented in the 60s and 70s. What I will emphasize is the 60s and 70s drawings were conservative in claiming what was actually there. So there's no contradiction with what was originally documented. There's just additional detail to add. As with other motifs on Stela 5 specifically, the Clark and Moreno drawings have gone to a detail maximizing level that is not sustained by texture mapping. It's very difficult to identify the body of a crocodile on Stela 5 at Izapa. However, there are other stela at Izapa that do have a tree that does merge into a crocodile. Stela 25 does do exactly what Clark and Moreno identified, but that's not actually what's on Stela 5. In their methodology, they said that they intentionally mixed motifs from different stela together. I'm perfectly happy to accept what they've drawn as an artistic rendering. That is a correct statement. But to simultaneously claim it as the most detailed and accurate representation of Stela 5 at the same time is absolutely false. And both cannot exist at the same time, and surface texture mapping gives us the clear evidence, the primary evidence, that anybody can look at and compare and know. Next to the tree, just to the left, there is a figure that was interpreted early as appearing to have a hood over their face. The presence of that hood is very clear looking at the texture mapping. The details that have been interpreted as his face by Clark and Moreno, it's not clear from texture mapping how much of that really is face and deserves further investigation. One of the most difficult things on Stela 5, as portrayed by Clark and Moreno, originally had been described as an incense burner on the left and a small person, possibly a child or a small man, on the right, have been turned into incense burners with embellishment that they have taken from other stela. They've taken what would normally be considered rain glyphs, them into fire on the incense burner on the left. This is simply not correct. So the fact that they claim this about that incense burner gives me great concern about the wider claims that they've made. Because detail after detail after detail, they have been too artistic in what they have claimed is correct and accurate. The surface texture map on the right-hand side shows someone that appears to be in a seated position with what could be a stylus. Others have claimed it could be other things, but the surface texture map doesn't give us additional detail to claim anything other than what has already been stated. The texture mapping has a lot to elucidate and clarify about the primary figure that's above the ground level. Most people look at it as a god figure.
Based on the wings, Olmec deity hieroglyphic, apron, and bird beak, some refer to this historically as the first figure to reference the Mayan god Quetzalcoatl. Some have referenced Quetzalcoatl as a Christ figure. Clark and Moreno changed this Maya god symbol and drew an additional figure on the tree.
There appears to be a woman reaching out of the tree. The texture mapping favors that it would actually be an extension of that deity, probably a bird mask or beak extending toward the tree. I believe this is one of those cases where potentially the methodology that Clark and Moreno used of zooming in, they zoomed in so far, they got to enough surface texture that you could almost connect the dots into a pattern that they wanted to be there. That maybe there were some sympathetic patterns, but it's not sustained as being true carving. Garth Norman's drawings were very accurate, with hardly any exceptions. Every line that he has proposed on his line drawing remains. I've been down to see Izapa many times. I've seen it by day. I've seen it by rain. I've seen it by shine. I've seen it by night. I've been inside the enclosures. I've examined them up close. I've measured them myself. This is a place that I have a deep respect for and an incredible passion for trying to document in the most accurate way that we can. I have been to all of the significant stela that have been relocated to other museums, the Tapachula Museum, the National Museum in Mexico City, and been able to have the same intimacy that I've had in the field in terms of documenting with surface texture mapping and photogrammetry and physical measurements. I have since been to Society of American Archaeology, their annual meeting, multiple times, and presented to the best scholars, particularly of Mesoamerica in the world, and been received very well. There is additional documentation to do, and that will be forthcoming.
As we literally and figuratively shed more light onto the carvings of Izapa, this evidence provides an expanded foundation to re-examine the interpretation of the messages of Izapa with increased context. RTI, along with new breakthroughs in computer modeling technology, are now enabling the restoration of the Izapa temple complex in virtual reality. This will provide greater access to Izapa for everyone from researchers to Mayan school children who want to learn about the roots of their civilization, Izapa's rightful place in world history.
As you can see, there's been a lot of detailed comparisons between the various drawings. It's been a privilege to be able to approach so closely and be so intimate with the amazing artifacts left behind from, a couple millennia ago. And I count it an honor to be among you all tonight, and thank you for your attention. And we're happy to take questions so long as Jim allows us to keep talking.
Well, thank you guys. That was really, really informative, and a lot of hard work you guys are putting in there. I've been to Izapa maybe 3 or 4 times, but you beat me, dude. You're in there the daytime, nighttime, everywhere. That's fantastic. I don't, does anybody have any questions? I don't see any in the chat feature yet. One guy, Jose, was saying how interesting it was, and it's nice to see he being part Maya descent to see the past being illuminated like this. For those of you looking at the chat, Dennis put a link to a video, which I will also share in the description of the recording. So you'll have that in the future. I don't really see any questions. Does anybody?
Well, I have a quick question.
Sure, go ahead.
So obviously this is we are all interpreting what we see. And my question is how do you all make sure that we don't fall into biased point of views, right? So and I'm curious to hear from you if there has been kind of interpretations that you've taken within consultation with Maya communities. Because our concern as Maya communities is that we normally don't get our voice heard. And then there are people that are coming from a different perspective that are seeing this and then are basing this based on potentially biased views. So my question is, how do you include or how do you are able to have Maya communities come in to interpret this? Because obviously there may be a lot of, like you mentioned the world tree, or you mentioned, things like figures like Jesus Christ, which have nothing necessarily to do with Maya oral history or traditions. And how are you being careful with making sure that you're not interpreting it from your biased point of view?
So I would respond to say, none of us are completely free from bias, ever, right? First, I think it's important that we acknowledge bias. Second, I think it's essential that we provide as much primary evidence as possible. And so what is typically used for interpretation are 2D line drawings. That's of necessity. These, the carvings are very difficult to appreciate without 2D line drawings. I'm completely in favor of 2D line drawings. But where there are to create a 2D line drawing, you have to interpret it. There is no other way to do it because you have to decide what was carved and what was not carved, detail on that, any particular stela or the collection of stelae. Garth Norman was very interested that as much involvement from Mayan and I would describe maybe the local culture be involved as possible. As we would go to Society for American Archaeology events together, we would always be so proud and thrilled that those that are native Spanish speakers that have the best access to these monuments and live nearby them are really engaging in a very meaningful way. I think there was a time, specifically when Garth started, where there may not have been as much resource available to them as there is now. Resource is always scarce, right, among all archaeology projects in my experience. But we're thrilled to be able to involve them. Dennis has been very instrumental in trying to capture the voice of as many people whose ancestral heritage aligns to these cultures as possible. And maybe I'll hand over to Dennis if he has anything else to add.
Yeah, we would. Everybody hear me? Great.
Yes.
I'd very much like to go on an expedition where I could interview Mayan elders who have an understanding of the culture and so forth and juxtapose those interviews with interviews, say, of the Native American I'm speaking of that I met and others. I'd like to see something done where we look at different cultures throughout the world and on the tree of life and see what areas of the tree of life do we have in common on the stone. I think that would be very interesting to do. So maybe hopefully that answers your question, and perhaps you could be assistance to us. It sounds like you have a great interest in this also.
Let's see, Graham's asking, are any of the models available to view online?
So
You
the
guys
answer,
got a website, don't you? Yeah.
we do. Dennis, do you want to comment?
I'll put a link to a model that you can, it's actually a virtual model that you can put Stella 5 in your front room. Use your iPhone or iPad to do that. Also put a link up to a 3D vision of a panorama of Plaza A out of the Unreal Game Engine that we recreated Plaza A, and I'll give Jim those links and he'll can post them. It'll take me a minute to do them here. If I can, before we're done, I'll get those links, okay?
I'll include those links when I send out the emails about the recording, so everybody can have them handy. Rob would like to browse Sketchfab online for 3D models, but not all uploads are very good. Are any of your models uploaded anywhere? So this is kind of the same question. Norman asks, what is the fear about using 3D scanning?
I don't know. I would love that. This is not a restriction placed by me. And I'm hopeful that this technique's super powerful, right? It does things no other technique will do very well, but I believe we should use 3D scanning as well, whether it's structured line scanning or laser light scanning. I'm happy with either of those. This was a restriction on the permit that we were able to be approved for by the local archaeological, authorities. And so my hope is that over the next, hopefully not very long, because things continue to weather, approval is given and they can be documented and captured in that way as well.
All right. Diane Winters, go ahead.
There are so many badly weathered Mayan monuments out there. Is anybody else beginning to pick up on other sites to use some of this technology to get things before they further disappear?
The answer is yes, but not at the rate we would like it to happen.
Yeah, okay.
Why we're presenting here tonight. How's that? I hope everybody is aware of a lot of the LiDAR studies that are going on, which is an airborne laser scanning technique at a very large scale, which is helping to identify the sites. The interesting thing is we've identified now so many sites that the budget that exists for funded archaeology already struggles to stretch, to embrace all of those as well. And so I think there is a balancing act between those that have know-how and those who are willing and those who have means, and where those three can come together. It's super.
And the money and the funding, I guess, too.
Yes, that's what I meant by means. So we acknowledge and thank those who spend their own money to do this type of activity, and those that are patrons to others that assist. And thank you so much for that. And again, the fusion of these technologies is so exciting that we hope it'll become a pattern others will follow more readily.
Is anyone else currently doing it, or that's just the hope?
The answer is yes. Dennis, do you want to add to that?
Well, there's many sites now that are using this RTI technology. Some of the major sites.
Okay, good.
It's used worldwide now on archaeology sites.
Sure.
It's amazing.
Sure.
When I first started doing it, it was not very well known. And I actually engaged quite a lot with kind of we were kind of pushing the limits, if that makes sense. And now we're really happy that it's spread so much more widely. The coming of what I'm going to describe as the 3D virtual world, we're already seeing tidbits of it. You may have, kind of virtual reality headsets already. The thing that Dennis is linking you to is actually an augmented reality. So it allows you to kind of display in front of you through your phone a three-dimensional representation of these stelae that I believe it's going to become a massive tool over the next couple of decades to where everyone who wants to be a current Mayan scholar should be engaging with 3D digital content. And those that are in the field should be using it in order to make available to a much wider potential consumer base the information. Thanks.
All right. Marilee, I'd like to know where is a recent interpretation of Stela 5?
That's part of the challenge. Most of the and there are many, current interpretations. Most of them are based on the most recent widely circulated drawing set, which was finalized and published in 2007. There are significant errors in 2007 if you don't understand what's being represented there. And so I think we're due for another interpretation. We were asked earlier about bias. My expertise is really specific to the capture side, to capture that primary documentation. And I rely on working closely with archaeologists to do the additional interpretation. And so I think that there are some interpretations from the 60s and 70s and maybe 80s that should be revisited based on how well we've confirmed the content of what was on those drawings. But there's certainly a lot of future interpretation to be done, particularly because the excavation context for Izapa and the areas around it, Camino Julio and others, right, that are all date to this sort of similar period, it's exploded in the last 30 years. So the frame of reference to be able to see the true, art history of that whole area, now there's so much more to cross-reference, whereas so much of the work at Izapa in the 70s was the first of its kind and almost standalone without the same level of detail, or, for at least a little period.
All right, and Marilyn's asking concerning the alignments on the stela, could you list the names of the alignments?
There are many, and the website we've referred to you is a really good place to start. Garth Norman published a book in 2015 that laid out many of those alignments. They relate to, the normal times of year you would expect, when the solstice happens, when the equinox is. If you're a fan of the sort of 260-day sacred calendar segment, the 260 and 105, the way you divide the year, there's specifically a pillar ball. And so the zenith dates, which are in April and August, there is no shadow on that kind of central monument there in the middle. And it's exciting to be there for that. Often there's a gathering of people who know what's going on. I'd encourage you to try and go where you can. And then the pillar balls alignment specifically to the high peaks on the horizon, another one. So Vincent Malmstrom and Garth's work and others since, all very exciting.
All right, and Lorraine thinks that is awesome. And her first degree was in geology and in oil and gas exploration. And they've been using 3D modeling for a long time with the addition of 4D to show movement. Yeah.
Really grateful that the oil and gas industry has enough budget to help further the tools that we can then use for archaeology. So we appreciate it.
All right. Well, it looks like the questions have slowed down. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question?
I think there's one from a little earlier from Mary Lynn. And she asked, has anyone created line drawings on paper while being very close to the stela? I guess this would also be subject to human error. So the answer to that is yes. And in fact, the proximity to the stone is, Clark and Moreno specifically, the artist Moreno, he actually used acetate paper and put it right up against the stone and traced directly off of the stone. The problem with these stones is that they're curved in two directions. So paper does a really good job of curving one way, right, at a time. It does not curve two ways at once without crinkling, and paper doesn't stretch very well. And so that's really the challenge here, is you've got, double curvature, not extreme double curvature, but enough double curvature and enough recesses that it's not very practical to take a non-stretchy medium and actually get a good trace off of it, in my opinion. So these digital techniques, I think, are going to provide us with a way to to interrogate what is now a three-dimensional physical item using a three-dimensional digital item, which I think is probably the best representation we'll get to without having multiple physical copies.
Yeah.
Hope that helps.
All right. Any more questions? When Marilyn says she wasn't thinking about tracing, she meant drawing without tracing.
Understood.
Yeah.
I would respond to that by saying, if you look at the history of line drawings, I'm sure several of those were done in the field. And I know specifically that the New World Archaeological Foundation, they were in the field for months, for over, I think it was a 12-year period, and they were there months at a time, and they would draw and go and compare and come back and draw and go back and forth. So I don't think physical proximity has been the limiting factor. I really think the difficulty is that relief has grown very shallow. Frequently you'll see carving that is, down to a millimeter or less. Even microns is probably not so much of a stretch, 100 microns to 120 microns. It's small.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you've ever tried drawing in the field to something badly weathered, your eye is so distracted by so many other things, by the texture of the stone, by color shifts in the tone in the stone itself, and just that when it's very narrow relief, very shallow relief, what you're doing can really see better than you can see with your eye.
Thanks for offering that, Diana.
Rob's asking, what about molds?
So molds are discouraged from the current archaeological authorities. There have been multiple molds taken. I have gone to see the casts of the results of those molds, and we've actually done RTI on the cast version. The first cast version, typically when you do a mold, you'll do a sort of a rubber tuffy, or silicon, initially right up against the surface. And then you need a strong backing to keep that in its right shape, so that later when you try to recast, the weight of, the plaster or whatever you're casting into doesn't actually distort the surface. Unfortunately, the first casting that was made, the rubber tuffy portion was done. I don't know if they missed the hard backing or if it wasn't strong enough, but either way, it was then redone a little bit later. And the RTI that I did of the cast, those rubber tuffy molds, I understand they've pretty much disintegrated because they were done now, 40 or 50 years ago. But the cast that remains, A, it's got porosity in it, and B, it is deformed. When they cast it, it is much flatter than the actual stone itself. And so it's useful for a point of reference, but I don't consider it to be an accurate recreation. We actually have the option potentially of 3D printing at large scale some of these, which is probably our best path. We just love to be able to texture and color, sorry, not texture, but color the texture at the same time. And 3D printing, currently you can go big or you can do color. You can't do really big color yet.
All righty. Well, with that, I guess we'll end it. Dennis, Jason, this has been really, really good. And I've already got people asking for the recording, which I'll put up in a few days. And I'll add these links that Dennis noted in the chat. I'll add those. And if there's any other links that you'd like, send them on. And I just thank you. Do you have any final comments or?
Was it nice being here? Thanks for all the questions.
Thank you, Dennis.
It's great. I have an example if you want to see one last tidbit. This is your bonus for 30 seconds. If I can share my screen, let me see.
Oh, you're not going to share that one, are you?
Well, I thought I'd just share my screen if I can. So this is, hopefully you can see what's on screen now. This is the RTI viewer that we use. And you'll notice this stela is covered with lichen. And so it's very hard to see what's there. And so the description of being able to turn this on and adjust how much color is there, right? So we can, first off, we've got kind of the shininess turned up, but I can turn this color completely off and get to something that allows me to really look at the texture at a level that's very difficult to do when you've got all the color turned all the way up. So that's just as a little example of how the tool works. I'll be done now. Thanks so much. Have a great evening. And I hope these digital tools reach your lives in many ways, including reaching back in time and forward. Thanks.
Thanks for viewing this Aztlander presentation. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander Magazine of the Americas, contact your host, Jim Reed, at mayaman@bellsouth.net. Enjoy life, enjoy learning, enjoy the Aztlander.